Right, so that leads me into the next part, which would be, what is a Thomas Jefferson education? Like, what are all the components that people need to know to get started? How do they implement? Easy question.
Well, I wish it were easier, but it really is. It's more than just, it's kind of a lifestyle. It's kind of a mindset.
Mm.
It really sort of, it sort of informs so much of the way you approach your living. I'll tell you, there's a fairly good introduction on our website at TJEd.org. There's a 3-video series that's free that you can get. And that kind of helps you get your start to wrap your mind around it. But basically, I've already kind of talked about the 3 types of learning, which is, there's the conveyor belt, and then there's sort of the professional conveyor belt where you're trying to jump through the hoops so that you can meet some job requirement or a licensing or whatever, which is great. Maybe that's part of your mission, but it's not a substitute for the kind of education where you have a sense of purpose that demands that you strive for excellence so that you can do what you're born to do.
I'm just gonna get on that. So this is what most people are doing, like with their kids, with their high school, because this is where I'm at right now. And my friends, it's conveyor belt. It's check the boxes. This is not like helping them develop into who they need to be. I just feel like that needed a repeating because it's so important.
I'll tell you, I recently did another event sort of like this, and because there's so many like TJEdisms, so many shorthand things. Yeah. I created a page where people could go to and sort of peruse. Let me just invite you to look at that. It's at tjed.org/cc.
Okay.
And on there, it will introduce you to the TJEd basics. One of them, I talked about the 3 types of learning. One is the phases of learning, and that is kids and adults don't learn the same. And not only that, but as my husband was kind of in his, time of self-discovery after he left formal college, he really went deep into studying great education through the ages and kind of got stalled on the Revolutionary era because there are so many people in that time who had this amazing education that rose to the level of, taking on the greatest power in the world and writing these documents that have, had such enduring impact, not just on them there, but on people everywhere since then. It was a powerful, movement of well-educated individuals. In fact, John Kennedy, when he was president, hosted a luncheon for some of the for some Nobel Prize laureates. And I have to put my phone down, it keeps bugging me. Anyway, so he was hosting some Nobel laureates for lunch at the White House, and he stood before them to welcome them before they sat to lunch and said that this was the greatest collection of minds and talent, and I'm paraphrasing, forgive me, but the greatest collection of talent and mind ever to sit down at the White House, with the possible exception of when Thomas Jefferson dined alone.
Oh, wow.
And it's true. He was quite the Renaissance man. If somebody met him along the way and they talked about botany, they would think he was a botanist. They would think he was a medical doctor. He was a musician. He was an architect. He was so amazingly accomplished in all these amazing areas. But really what matters to me in this day and age is that he was able to write the Declaration of Independence. And I wish everyone would read that, because that is a document that changes the world. But this is why we call TJEd a Thomas Jefferson education, not because we want to do exactly what he did or follow the steps that he followed, but we want to be the kind of individual that when the moment calls, you are prepared for it. That's what it is to have a Thomas Jefferson education. So, but as my husband was discovering, this little hotspot of all these amazingly educated individuals, he started to ask himself, how is it that Madison and Washington and Jefferson and Adams and all of these guys at the same time and place, what is it that they did in common? And so he sort of deconstructed it. How do you get a man at 24 who's got that? And so he looked backwards, and what happened before? Well, he turns out he studied really long, hard, and effectively in his youth. He really nailed it in his youth. And so that, of course, became a critical component. How do you get youth to study long, hard, and effectively? That's like, not only is it hardly ever seen in this day and age, it's not valued, and it's not even thought of. People don't think that's a real thing. Nobody would do that.
Which is why I asked the original question, why are we doing this education thing? What is it for? You know, because if you have a different answer, if you have one answer, you may not value studying long and hard because it's just for getting a job, and that's not going to help you to get a job. You know what I mean? Like that, that mentality.
If that's what you think studying long and hard is for, then yeah, why would you do it if you don't care about that? But, and it can, studying long, hard, and effectively can mean different things to different missions. That's for sure.
That's true.
In our day, as in his day, studying long, hard, and effectively for perpetuating freedom is kind of a critical thing. And I hope enough of us do it, because if not, we won't be having these conversations 20 years from now. Our kids certainly won't have the prerogative to ask themselves what kind of education they want to give their kids.
Well, what is it? Is it France? Did they just outlawed homeschooling? Was it France, I believe? Yeah, France. They just outlawed it. It's been outlawed in Germany, and they outlawed it in France recently. Yeah.
Wow. So yeah, that's not, you don't think of these people as, you know, bearing swastikas and taking control of who gets to do what. And yet those people aren't free, and they aren't free to tell their children what they value.
Right.
And it's getting scarier and scarier that way. And if we don't get serious about perpetuating freedom right now, it's not going to be long before we don't get to talk about this stuff out loud. That's just the way it goes. There's a drift, and it either goes one direction or it goes the other direction. We're either having a freedom shift or we're having a force shift. Right now, we are in a polarizing moment where some are pulling really hard for a freedom shift and some are pulling really hard for a force shift. And we've got to decide where we stand and take that seriously. And our kids need to not just be good at what they do or know what they want to do for their life's work. They got to know how to be a citizen. They got to know how to, I'm telling you, 3 other books and
well, how do they get there? What are the, I know there's a lot to it and a lot of detail, but what are those basic components for how when your child is 24, how can they be ready for this? How can they be a really effective adult at that age, ready
is the phases
start
of
their mission and go?
Yeah, that is the phases of learning. They have to be that kind of youth. In order to be that kind of youth, though, something else has to come before that. And I will tell you, on that page I told you about, TJEd.org/CC, there's a panel on there that's sort of gray and beige that it outlines what I consider my mandate as a homeschooler. How do I know I did what I set out to do? What does it mean for me to be successful? What do I want for my youth as they're entering adulthood? And there's a list of qualities that I want to see in my youth when I turn them loose on the world. So if you're interested in seeing that, go to that page. Okay, so in order to have those youth, before that, we call that scholar phase. When they're studying, they learn to study long, hard, effectively. They don't start that way, but they have a little teeny germ of interest in it and hope that they get there. And when we treat that time right, it's a very natural process to get there. And TJEd High, by the way, kills it for that. But before that, we have what we call the love of learning phase. To study long, hard, and effectively, you have to have an appetite for it. You have to love to learn things. And so the time that comes right before that is called the love of learning phase. And through that time, they come to that place where they really learn to love learning and have this sense that it's for something. And in youth, they get more in touch with who they are and what they're for.
And what ages would that be? And what would that involve? What would that phase involve?
Okay, well, let me just give you one more phase, and that's core phase. Core phase is basically the years between 0 and 8. And that's where they learn about right, wrong, true, false, good, bad. And on that page that I told you about, tjed.org/cc, there's a link that will take you to an explanation of the phases of learning in more depth. But I'll just say for now, the early years of where you're building that foundation of who am I? What is truth? What is my relationship with my family? What is my relationship with the divine? How do I know what is right and wrong? And then from there, they learn to work and play and love and jump and sing and all the 4-letter words that are wonderful. And then from there, they transition into love of learning phase. And that's where they start to explore. Everything's sort of an open book. They're like a butterfly from one flower to the next, or a rabbit going on a trail, right? It's not about checklists. It's not about mastery. It's the beginning of things, not the end of things. So they don't have to have long-term commitments to lessons. They don't have to pass this test or that test before they can do this next thing. It's about building their sense of wonder, capitalizing on their creativity, helping them discover their interests and their gifts, helping them to begin to own that process of being a self-educator. And anything that we do during that time, or even earlier, that shuts down that sense of autonomy and that sense of wonder is going to bite us later.
Okay, what would shut down that sense of autonomy and wonder, and then what would encourage it? Things.
Okay, for example, little kid writes a story, brings you story, and you look at it and go, oh my gosh, I haven't done enough on their penmanship. Or look at the spelling on this. Let me tell you what, my dyslexic kids were a long time. In fact, neither of them have very good penmanship, and both of them have struggled with spelling. Both of them are actually almost at a normal level. My younger one, she's 19, not so much, but my 31-year-old, you would never know if I didn't tell you that he had this journey. But you've got this, say, 7-year-old that brings this story, and they're so excited to show it to you. And you're like, oh my gosh, okay, this letter's misspelled, and this letter's backwards. And, I can't even read it because you didn't punctuate it, and the words are all smashed together. There's no space between the words. And that's going to shut it down a little bit right there.
It just makes me cringe because I see people do it all the time.
But here's the thing. Can I tell you what is hard to teach? Creativity. Having content is the hardest part.
Yeah.
I have a daughter who just finished writing the 4th in her series of books, and they're awesome. So good.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. But I just went through this process of doing some editing on it, and, helping her figure out, I start so many sentences with and but, or I need to learn more about the use of colons and semicolons or whatever. And so even as a 24-year-old mother who's a very accomplished writer, I'm like, you know what? That's what I'm for. Through this editing process, she's learned a great deal. But you know what's hard? Being a person that can write 4 600-page books.
Yeah.
You know what's easy? Paying someone to get the colons right.
Or even if you don't have the money, just looking it up. Like there's like 14 main punctuation marks. It's
which is not to say that she hasn't figured it out, because she has.
Yeah.
She gets better each time. But if we had focused on, let's say, the frame instead of the picture,
yeah,
I'm not sure that picture would ever have developed.
Yeah.
That's how you shut down. You have to start with, learning through play, and then learning through projects, and then learning through this sense of purpose. And somewhere along the line, the rigor, the complete joyous abandon diminishes a little bit, and the rigor continues to grow. But then as that rigor gets to a place where you have some real mastery and skills, that joyous abandon returns, and you've got the simplicity on the other side of complexity. And you just have to always safeguard that autonomy and that sense of purpose. And that list of scholar qualities kind of brings that out.
So let's take writing, for example. And now I'm going to try to ask the questions that I think somebody who's new to homeschooling and maybe just pulled their child out of public school. Okay, so just bear with me. But let's take writing. So that's a good example of how not to just kill their desire to write, which I think is excellent, because a lot of people do that. I've probably been guilty of that in the past. But what if your child does not want to write? How do you get them to the place to where they ever really learn how to write if they just don't want to?
Well, I think it starts with, what do they want? What are their gifts? What are their interests? When you capitalize on those in love of learning, that kid gets to a place where we don't really coach the technical I mean, we'll support the technical. Like if I'm writing a letter, if my daughter's writing a letter to her grandparents, I'll say, well, let's not send that until all the spelling's right. Would you agree? Yeah, I agree. Let me help you with that. And that's fine. But to critique everything as if the most important thing were that, when they're just in that budding creator space, not only kills it, but it's just not time for it. There are steps of what you learn first. And that technical part is literally step 6.
Or even just creating, like say somebody's coming to homeschooling and they have a 13-year-old and the 13-year-old hates to write. And they're concerned about it and they want them to learn to write before, they go off into the world. And the kid is just like, I don't even want to create anything. How do they get from point A to point B to where they're...
That sounds like a kid who has lost out on their love of learning. And you kind of have to back up and retrace your steps. If you're on a path that's dangerous, and there's a better path and you must have taken a wrong turn, then you back up. And that kid is saying, we're on the wrong path. We took a wrong turn. And so you don't like find a way to make them like writing. You back up to make them love learning.
And then what would that look like for an older kid like that?
Same. I literally have a blog post called the 6-point plan. And it's about how point by point to detox and reset. Detox, I think a lot of people are familiar with that because it's like, I use the example of when I used to be in plays when I was in high school. You'd be in this musical and you've got all the things from auditions to casting to blocking to building sets and learning your lines and running all the scenes and blah, 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 blah. And finally you've got what you call Heck Week, where it's just nonstop rehearsals until ta-da, we're at the performance. And guess what happens? You've got your 2 weekends of performance or whatever. And then you have your cast party and then you fall into a show hole. It's like that thing just died and your life went with it. You've been living and breathing all this time where you have this constant feedback, these constant benchmarks, and this constant expectation of effort of how to succeed and thrive in that thing you're in the middle of. And then all of a sudden it's gone. And that's a very disconcerting feeling. And you find yourself with your friends, like reliving moments and saying your lines and, trying to capture that place where you feel safe again, like you feel like your life has meaning again. And this is how our kids feel when we pull them out of the conveyor belt. They have had so much constant feedback, so many expectations, their time was committed. It was an intense momentum to be in that environment. And then we come home and we either duplicate the thing that wasn't working well, or we try something entirely different that they have no emotional connection with. They don't trust it. It doesn't feel safe. It doesn't, and they either you or they or both of you are like on that merging onto that freeway and hitting the brakes. You want to go back to what's familiar. You want to, do the safe thing. And people talk about detox where you kind of pull yourself out of that. But for me, it's more than just removing the heat source when you're burning, right?
Yeah. It's like a rehabilitation, really.
Yeah, there has to be a healing. You have to have the proper nutrition. You have to have protection. But for me, it's not just for detoxing. I have used this reset literally in our life for multiple years at a time when we were going through crisis because of my husband's health issues and my son's health issues and stuff. This family reset helps your family to reconnect. It reestablishes the healthy relationships between siblings, the healthy relationship and parental leadership, and it helps you relocate your core and your love of learning. And I have, anytime something major happens in the family, or even minor happens in the life of a kid, maybe their best friend moved away, or maybe your dog has a batch of puppies, anything that disrupts the rhythm of the family, it's a good time to go back to the family reset. And I'm pretty sure I linked to that on that page I gave you, that resource page. And it just explains how to, and there are 6 steps, but then there are several paragraphs that follow. I would urge you to pick those paragraphs that follow apart because there's some nuggets in there that really make a difference. And when you actually take the time to do a reset, then you can retrace you've retraced back to the path, the fork in that road, and you get to take the path forward that's natural. And it is It is natural. It's like you don't have to make a baby learn to walk. You don't have to make a baby learn to talk. And you don't have to make a child transition into scholar phase. You create a healthy environment. There's modeling, there's resources, and it happens.